My husband handed me divorce papers at our anniversary dinner, slid them across the white tablecloth like a check. Then he leaned in and whispered, "I took everything, enjoy the streets." He was smiling when he said it. So were his parents, sitting right there at the table. They knew, they'd all known. What he didn't know was that 48 hours earlier, I had already spoken to an attorney. What none of them knew was what was sitting in my bag. I'm Dana. I'm 29. And for 6 years, I watched that man's family treat me like a guest who had overstayed her welcome in my own marriage. I kept quiet. I kept the peace. I kept receipts. I placed the prenuptial agreement on his plate with one clause highlighted. His girlfriend read it over his shoulder. She went completely still. His mother set down her wine glass. His father pushed back his chair. And my husband's face did something I had never seen it do in 6 years of marriage. If this story speaks to you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your location and local time in the comments. To understand why that dinner table felt like the last 6 years compressed into one moment, you have to understand what those 6 years actually looked like from the inside. Because from the outside, we looked fine. Looked better than fine, actually. Marcus and I met when I was 22 and he was 26. He was sharp, attentive, the kind of man who remembered details. He remembered what I ordered the first time we went to dinner, remembered my mother's birthday before I did once, remembered which side of the bed I preferred. In the beginning, that felt like love. I know now it was inventory. We got engaged after 18 months. His mother, Renata, hugged me at the announcement dinner and told me I was exactly what this family needed. His father, Gerald, shook my hand with both of his and said, "Welcome home, Dana." I believed them. That was the first mistake, but it took me years to understand it was a mistake at all. The prenuptial agreement came up 6 weeks before the wedding. Marcus brought it to me gently, apologetically almost, said it was Gerald's idea. Said Gerald had done it with Marcus's older brother too, so this was just how the family handled things. He handed me a single page with 2 glasses of wine already poured on the coffee table and said, "It's just a formality." I read it quickly. I signed it without a lawyer. That was the second mistake, and it was a much more expensive one. What the agreement said in plain language was this: any assets either of us brought into the marriage remained separate. What we built together would be split evenly in case of divorce. That sounded fair. That sounded reasonable. I was 23 years old and I believed it. What I didn't yet know was that Marcus had spent the 6 months before our engagement quietly moving his personal savings into a joint account with Gerald. Not a marital account. A family account I had no access to and no visibility into. By the time I signed that prenup, most of what Marcus owned on paper had already been relocated somewhere I couldn't touch. I didn't find that out for 4 more years. In the meantime, I worked. I was a project coordinator at a mid-sized logistics firm when we married. Within 2 years, I had been promoted twice. By year 4, I was managing a regional team and pulling in more than Marcus, which I only say because it mattered later in ways I did not anticipate. Marcus worked in commercial real estate, his family's business. He was good at it. Charming on the phone, precise in person. But the business belonged to Gerald, and Gerald made sure everyone knew it. Marcus never signed his own deals without Gerald's sign-off. He never hired without Renata's opinion. Every major decision in his professional life ran through that house in Westchester first. And that house was where I began to feel it. Not dramatically, not all at once. It started with small things. Thanksgiving, our first year married. I arrived with 2 dishes I had spent most of Wednesday preparing, a sweet potato gratin and a cranberry tart I'd spent time on, the kind of thing I was proud of. Renata looked at them, said, "How sweet," and set them on the counter furthest from the main table. Neither dish made it to the main spread. After dinner, I found them still wrapped on the kitchen counter. No one had touched them. Christmas the same year, I gave Gerald and Renata a framed photo of all of us from the wedding, something I had ordered professionally printed and custom framed. Nice frame. Real glass. Gerald thanked me and set it on the floor against the wall behind the couch. I saw it there 3 weeks later when we came back for a birthday dinner. Still on the floor, still leaning. I mentioned it to Marcus in the car on the way home. He said, "They're not really photo people." I let it go. That was the pattern. Something happened, I noticed it. I mentioned it to Marcus. He explained it away, I let it go. That cycle ran for years before I understood it wasn't a series of isolated incidents, it was a managed system. What broke the pattern the first time I felt it as something more than a slow chill was the house. We had been renting an apartment in the city since we got married. Marcus had always talked about buying. We had talked about it together, saved together, looked at listings together. By year 3, we had a down payment sitting in what I believed was our joint savings account. Then one weekend in October of year 4, Marcus told me he had found a place. He said found a place the way you'd say you found a parking spot. Casual, slightly pleased with himself. He pulled up photos on his phone at the kitchen table, slid it across to me. 3-bedroom colonial in a suburb 40 minutes from the city. Nice yard, finished basement. It was a good house. I asked when we were going to see it. He said the offer was already in. I put the phone down, I looked at him. I said, "You made an offer without telling me." He said his dad had found it first. Said Gerald had flagged it as a smart investment, said the market was moving fast and they didn't want to lose it, said it all happened quickly. I asked whose name was on the offer. He paused just long enough. Then he said, "Mine and my dad's for now, for the financing. But obviously it'll be ours once it closes." It never became ours. The house closed in Marcus's name and Gerald's name jointly. When I asked to be added to the title, Marcus said we'd talk to a lawyer about it. We never talked to a lawyer. When I brought it up again 6 months later, Marcus said adding me would complicate the mortgage structure. When I brought it up a third time, he said I was being paranoid. I started keeping a folder on my laptop that month, not because I had a plan. Just because something in me understood that I needed to stop letting things disappear. The first thing I put in that folder was a screenshot of the original listing. Date stamped. The house should have been the moment I woke up completely. Looking back, it was close. But Marcus was good at the slow walk back. The gradual re-explanation that made you feel like your alarm was the problem rather than the thing that triggered it. He took me to dinner the week after I found out about the title. Nice place, candles, the kind of dinner that costs enough to feel like an apology without ever requiring one. He ordered wine I liked and talked about the house like it was still ours, described which room would be the office, which wall he wanted to knock down eventually, what the backyard would look like in summer. By the end of the night, I had almost talked myself back into believing it. Almost. I kept the folder. I just didn't add to it yet. We moved into the house the following spring. I painted 2 of the rooms myself. I planted things in the backyard. I drove 40 minutes each way to my job without complaining, because Marcus said the commute would get easier once I got used to it. I made that house feel like a home the way I had made every other part of our life feel like a home, quietly, without being asked, without getting credit. Renata visited 3 weeks after we moved in. She walked through every room with her arms folded, pausing at doorways, nodding slightly like a property inspector. She stopped in the kitchen, looked at the backsplash I had chosen and said, I would have gone with something more neutral." Then she opened my cabinets, reorganized 2 of them without asking, and left a note on the counter about a plumber she wanted us to use. I stood in that kitchen after she left and took a breath so slow it hurt. Marcus said she meant well. I said she reorganized our kitchen. He said, "She's particular, you know how she is." I did know how she was, that was the problem. What I was still learning was how Marcus was, because Marcus operated through a specific kind of softness that made it very hard to name what he was doing. He never shouted, he never called me names, he managed, he redirected, he reframed. When I was upset, he was calm. When I was calm, he was affectionate. When I was affectionate, he was slightly distant. The cycle kept me off balance in a way I spent years trying to stabilize rather than trying to escape. The distance got more pronounced after year 4. Small things at first. Coming home later without explanation. Being on his phone more in the evenings, screen tilted away. Canceling small plans we had made and replacing them with last-minute things involving his family. A birthday dinner out became a birthday dinner at his parents' house. A weekend trip I had been planning for months became a let's do that another time, and then a Friday night poker game at Gerald's. I noticed all of it. I said some of it out loud. He said I was keeping score. Maybe I was, but I was keeping score because the numbers were starting to look wrong. The first time I had real evidence of something more than emotional neglect was in the fall of year 5. I had been promoted again. Regional director now, managing a team of 11, overseeing 3 distribution hubs in the Northeast Corridor. It was the biggest role I had ever held, and I had earned it in the plainest possible way, by being better at the job than anyone else who wanted it. My manager told me directly. The promotion came with a salary increase that put me well into 6 figures for the first time. I came home that evening and told Marcus. He said, "That's great, babe," without looking up from his phone. Then he said, "Hey, can you grab my dry cleaning tomorrow? I forgot to go today." I stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at him for a moment. He was still looking at his phone. I went and got the dry cleaning the next day. That's the part I'm not proud of, but something shifted in me after that. Quietly. The way a door settles differently in its frame after the house has moved. I started paying more careful attention to our finances. Not suspiciously at first, just methodically. I was earning more now, and I wanted to understand where things stood. I logged into our joint checking account and found it thinner than I expected. Not dangerously thin, but thinner. I cross-referenced what I had deposited against what had gone out. The math was slightly off. I checked again the following month, still slightly off. I printed both statements and put them in the folder. Then I found something that had nothing to do with the checking account. I was looking for a document in Marcus's home office, a copy of our homeowner's insurance policy that I needed for a claim. He had told me it was in the top drawer of his filing cabinet. I opened the drawer, moved through the folders toward the back, and found a folder labeled simply with a set of initials that weren't mine and weren't his. Inside was a lease agreement. A studio apartment in the city. 12-month lease, signed 8 months earlier, in Marcus's name alone. The address was a neighborhood I knew. Nice building. The monthly rent was not small. I stood at that filing cabinet for a long time. I photographed every page with my phone, put the folder back exactly as I had found it. Found the insurance policy 2 folders over, closed the drawer, went downstairs, made dinner. He came home an hour later and kissed me on the cheek and asked what smelled good. I said, "Chicken." He said, "Perfect." I added the lease photographs to the folder that night. Then I opened a new document and started a timeline. The timeline started as a single page. Within 3 weeks it was 4. I wasn't frantic about it. That surprised me, honestly. I had expected that once I started pulling on the thread I would either fall apart or become obsessed, but instead I went very calm and very precise. Something in me had been waiting for permission to stop pretending the numbers added up. And once I stopped pretending, the clarity was almost a relief. I kept working. I kept cooking dinner. I kept making the 40-minute drive. I kept asking Marcus about his day and listening to his answers and saying the right things at the right moments. He noticed nothing different. That told me something about how present he had ever really been. The timeline covered what I could document: dates, amounts, account statements, the lease, conversations I remembered with enough specificity to write down. I noted the house title situation with dates. I noted the months where the joint checking was short and by how much. I noted the lease. I noted a pattern I had started to see in the joint savings, where deposits I made appeared and then shrank over the following weeks in ways that didn't match our regular expenses. I was not a forensic accountant. I want to be clear about that. I was a woman with a laptop, a printer, and a filing folder of her own that she kept inside a work bag Marcus never touched. But I was organized by profession, and I was angry in a way that had finally found a useful direction. And that combination turned out to be enough to see the shape of what was happening even before I could prove all of it. What the shape looked like was this: Marcus was building a second life, and he was using our shared finances to fund it. The studio apartment was the clearest piece. 8 months of rent on a place I had never seen, paid from an account that was supposed to be ours. But there were other charges that started to make sense once I had the lease as a reference point. Restaurant charges in neighborhoods near that apartment, on evenings when Marcus had texted me that he was working late or stuck in traffic. A charge at a home goods store I didn't recognize, the kind of charge you make when you're furnishing a space. A florist charge in February that was not for me. I had received nothing on Valentine's Day that year. Marcus had said he wasn't a flowers person. He had apparently reconsidered. I kept adding to the timeline. I kept my face neutral at dinner. The part that took longer to absorb was the degree to which his family was already positioned around what was coming. I pieced that together more slowly, but once I started seeing it, I couldn't unsee it. Renata had stopped including me in certain conversations sometime in the past year. Not dramatically. She was too careful for that. But there were phone calls with Marcus that ended when I walked into the room. There were dinners at the Westchester house where Gerald and Marcus would drift into the study after the meal, and the door would close and Renata would find a reason to keep me in the kitchen. I had noticed it. I had filed it under Renata being Renata. Now I filed it somewhere else. Gerald had lunch with Marcus every Thursday. I knew this because Marcus had mentioned it early in our marriage as a standing thing, a father-son tradition, and I had thought it was nice. What I understood now was that those lunches were not just tradition. They were operational. Gerald was the one who had structured the house purchase. Gerald was the one who held the family business accounts. If Marcus was preparing to exit the marriage and protect his assets, Gerald was not surprised by that plan. Gerald was probably part of it. That realization landed differently than the others. The affair I could metabolize as Marcus's failure. The financial maneuvering I could metabolize as Marcus's greed. But Gerald and Renata sitting across from me at holiday dinners for 5 years, welcoming me with both hands and already knowing what the plan was, that one sat in my chest like something cold. I added a section to the timeline labeled simply, family involvement. I didn't have documentation yet, but I noted the patterns. Then the patterns gave me something concrete. I came home early one Thursday afternoon in November. I had a migraine that had made the drive home miserable, and I had texted Marcus but gotten no reply. I let myself in, dropped my bag in the entryway, and heard voices in the kitchen. Marcus and Gerald. They had not heard me come in. I stopped in the hallway. Gerald was saying something about timeline. Marcus said a name I didn't recognize, said it quietly, and Gerald said to keep it clean and keep it simple, said that the paperwork would look a lot better if it happened before the end of the year, said that the attorney had been very clear about the advantage of moving while the account structures were still set up the way they were. I did not move. Marcus said something about me, used my name, said I wouldn't see it coming because I never pushed hard enough when it mattered. Gerald made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then Marcus said, "She signed the prenup without reading it properly. That was the ball game." I stood in that hallway and heard my husband describe the last 6 years of my life as a ball game he had already won. I did not walk into the kitchen. I went back to the front door, opened it quietly, closed it loudly, and called out that I was home. By the time I reached the kitchen, Gerald was refilling his coffee and Marcus was looking at his phone, and the conversation had been packed away like it had never happened. I said I had a headache, was going to lie down. Renata's name was not mentioned, but she had been at that house that Thursday. Her car had been in the driveway. I had seen it when I pulled in. I went upstairs. I lay in the dark for 20 minutes. Then I got up, opened my laptop, and wrote down every word I could remember, time-stamped. The timeline was now 5 pages. I went to work the next morning like nothing had happened. That was the only way I knew how to function at that point. Compartmentalize hard enough that the outside stays clean while the inside does its work. My team had a quarterly review that Friday. 11 people around a conference table, projections on the screen, me running the room. I did it well. I always did it well. One of my directors, a woman named Patris who had been with the company longer than I had, told me afterward that the presentation was the clearest she had seen the regional numbers broken down. I thanked her and meant it. I sat at my desk after everyone filed out and looked at the wall for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and called a financial advisor. Not a lawyer yet, not yet. I called a financial advisor because what I needed first was to understand what I actually had, what was actually mine, and what had already been moved somewhere I couldn't reach. I had a colleague who had gone through a divorce 2 years earlier and had mentioned a name, someone good, someone thorough. I had filed that name away without knowing why. I called it. The advisor's name was Carol. She had a calm, methodical voice, and she did not seem surprised by anything I told her. I laid out what I knew. The joint checking, the savings discrepancies, the house title, the prenup I had signed at 23 without counsel, the studio lease, the conversation in the hallway. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 3 specific questions about account structures and timelines and told me to bring everything I had documented to an appointment the following week. She said, "You've done the right things so far. Don't move money yet and don't signal that you know." I said I understood. I went home and made dinner. The week between that call and the appointment with Carol was one of the stranger weeks of my life. I was living 2 parallel existences in the same house. One Dana was making dinner and asking about Marcus's day and watching television on the couch with her husband's arm around her. The other Dana was sitting at a laptop at midnight building a financial picture of a marriage that had been a construction from nearly the beginning. Marcus was in good spirits that week. That was its own kind of information. He was warm, attentive in the easy surface way he could be when he wanted to be. He brought home food from a restaurant I liked on Wednesday without being asked. He rubbed my shoulders briefly while I was standing at the kitchen counter and said I seemed tense. I said it was just work. He said, "You push yourself too hard." I nearly laughed. I held it. I met with Carol on Tuesday. She went through everything I brought with a focused quiet that made me trust her immediately. She pulled up account structures I hadn't known to look for, traced movement patterns, cross-referenced the prenup language against what I had described about the house purchase. At one point, she stopped and looked at me over the top of her reading glasses and said, "How long did you say you've been married?" I said almost 6 years. She nodded slowly. Said, "Okay." That okay carried a lot of weight. What Carol confirmed was worse than what I had suspected, though not worse than what I had feared at the darkest point of those midnight sessions. The joint savings had been systematically drawn down. Not emptied suddenly, which would have been visible, but reduced in increments over roughly 14 months. Small enough amounts each time to read as ordinary expenses if you weren't looking closely. The money had not simply been spent. Carol traced it, partially, to a business account held under a subsidiary of Gerald's company that Marcus was listed as a co-manager of. A company I had never heard of, had never been mentioned, had been created just over 2 years ago. The house was effectively untouchable under the current title structure, she said. Gerald's name being on it alongside Marcus's, combined with the way the purchase had been financed, meant I had no claim to it even as a marital asset in most readings of the prenup I had signed. She said a family law attorney would need to assess the full picture, but that the prenup, as written, had several clauses that were unusually favorable to Marcus given that I had signed it without counsel. She said this carefully, like she was reading a report. She was not unkind. I asked her what any of this meant practically. She said it meant that if Marcus filed for divorce tomorrow under the current documented asset picture, I would walk away with my personal bank account, my salary, and my car. The house, the savings, and any investment structures connected to Gerald's business would likely be beyond my reach. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked what would change that picture. She said, evidence of fraud, or a clause in the prenup that was violated. I drove home and opened the prenup document I had photographed the day Marcus handed it to me, the original I had somehow held onto. I read it properly this time. All 4 pages, every clause. I almost missed it. Buried in the 3rd page, in a clause about marital conduct and asset management, was a line about financial disclosure. Both parties were required to disclose all existing assets and liabilities truthfully at the time of signing. A breach of that disclosure requirement voided the asset protection clauses for the breaching party. Marcus had moved his savings into Gerald's account before we got engaged, before the prenup was signed. He had not disclosed that. I read the clause 3 times. Then I photographed the page, added it to the folder, and opened a new tab to search for family law attorneys. I was done being the Dana who let things go. I found my attorney the way you find most important things when you're finally ready to look seriously. Not through a flashy website or a billboard, but through a person who had been through something similar and came out the other side intact. Patris. We had worked together for 3 years and I trusted her in the professional sense completely, but we had never crossed into the personal. She was 10 years older than me, divorced, raised her daughter alone, never made it dramatic. She was the kind of person who showed up early and left late and never needed credit for either. I respected her enormously. I asked her to lunch on a Wednesday. Neutral place, near the office, nothing loaded about the ask. We ordered and made work conversation for the first 10 minutes and then I just told her. Not everything, but enough. I said I thought my husband had been moving money, that I had found a lease for an apartment I had never been to, that the house wasn't in my name, that I had consulted a financial advisor and been told the picture was bad. I said it plainly, the way Carol had spoken to me without theater. Patris put her fork down and looked at me. She said, "How long have you known something was wrong?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "Years," but I kept explaining it away. She nodded like that was the most familiar sentence she had ever heard. Then she said, "I know someone. She's the reason I kept my apartment and my daughter's college fund. I'm going to text you her name right now." The attorney's name was Helen. Patris texted it before we had finished lunch. I called Helen's office that afternoon from my car in the parking garage. Her assistant scheduled me for the following Monday. When I sat down across from Helen that Monday, I understood immediately why Patris had used the word reason. Helen was in her 50s, compact, precise, with the particular stillness of someone who had heard every version of every bad marriage story and was no longer surprised but remained genuinely engaged. She made me feel like my situation was serious without making me feel like it was hopeless. I laid out everything: the prenup, the house, the savings drainage, the lease, the subsidiary company, the conversation I had overheard in the hallway, the disclosure clause I had found on page 3. Helen took notes on a legal pad in a handwriting so small I couldn't read it from across the desk. She asked sharp questions. She circled things. She asked me twice about the timeline of the savings account movements relative to when the subsidiary company was formed. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The disclosure clause is real. If we can demonstrate that he moved assets before the prenup was signed and failed to declare them, the asset protection structure that prenup gives him falls apart. That doesn't automatically mean you get half of everything, but it means the prenup doesn't protect him the way he thinks it does." I felt something loosen in my chest. She said the next step was a forensic accountant, someone who could formally trace the asset movements and produce documentation that would hold in a proceeding. She had someone she worked with regularly. She said I should not yet do anything that would alert Marcus, should not move money, should not change behavior, should not consult anyone else without running it by her first. She said, "He likely has a timeline of his own. The question is whether we can be ready before he moves." I asked her what ready looked like. She said, "Everything documented, everything backed up off-site, and you understanding exactly what you're entitled to claim so that, when he makes his move, you're already 2 steps ahead of it." I left her office and sat in my car and felt, for the first time in months, something that was not dread. It wasn't confidence yet. It was more like the specific steadiness that comes when you stop waiting for someone else to tell you the situation is as bad as you already know it is. Patris checked in with me the next morning with a one-line text. Just, "How'd it go?" I wrote back, "Good, really good." She sent back a single thumbs up. That was all we needed to say. Over the following weeks, Helen moved efficiently. The forensic accountant, a man named Douglas who wore short-sleeved button-downs and spoke in bullet points, went through the financial picture with a precision that was almost beautiful in its thoroughness. He confirmed what Carol had outlined and went further. The subsidiary company had received 11 transfers from our joint savings over 14 months. The total was just under $40,000. The transfers had been structured carefully, amounts under reporting thresholds, irregular enough in timing to avoid a pattern on casual inspection. But Douglas was not doing a casual inspection. He also found something Carol had not. There was a second account, not the subsidiary. A personal account in Marcus's name alone, opened 4 years into our marriage, funded initially by a transfer from the joint savings account on a date I recognized immediately, because it was the week after my first big promotion. The week Marcus had said, "That's great, babe," without looking up from his phone. He had moved money the week I got promoted. Like a reflex. Douglas put his notes on the table and said the total redirected from marital accounts, across both the subsidiary transfers and the personal account, came to just over $62,000. I wrote that number down, added it to the timeline. Helen said we were close to ready. She said she wanted 2 more weeks to finalize the forensic report and make sure everything was properly backed up and filed. She said when the time came, she would know how to use the prenup clause in a way that would be very difficult for Marcus or his family to anticipate. She also said something that I kept coming back to in the days that followed. She said, "Men like this tend to make their move somewhere public and theatrical. They like the moment. They like the feeling of control. When he does it, let him have the stage. You'll be ready." I didn't know then that the stage would be our anniversary dinner, but I filed that away too. The anniversary dinner was Marcus's idea. That should have told me something. In 6 years of marriage, Marcus had remembered our anniversary with genuine effort exactly twice. Year 1, because everything in year 1 was still a performance. Year 3, because he had done something the week before that required repair, and the dinner was the repair. Every other year it had been a last-minute reservation somewhere decent, or a gift card, or nothing at all with an apology scheduled for the following weekend. So when he brought it up 6 weeks in advance, mentioning a specific restaurant, a place we had talked about going for years but never had, I noted it. Not with alarm, with attention. I mentioned it to Helen at our next meeting. She said, "Interesting. When is it?" I told her the date. She looked at her calendar. Said Douglas's report would be finalized well before then. Said we would be ready. I asked if she thought the dinner was connected to his timeline. She said, "I think he wants a setting. Somewhere he feels in control. Somewhere with witnesses who know him." She paused. "I'd want to know who else is coming." I found out 2 weeks later when Marcus mentioned, casually over breakfast, that his parents would be joining us. Said it like an afterthought. Said his mother had always wanted to try the restaurant and it seemed like a nice way to make an evening of it. I said, "Of course." He looked up briefly, said, "You don't mind?" I said, "Why would I mind?" He went back to his phone. He was almost smiling. I texted Helen from the bathroom 10 minutes later. She responded within the hour, said, "Good. That actually helps us. Come in Thursday." At Thursday's meeting, Helen walked me through what she had prepared. Douglas's forensic report was complete. 47 pages, fully documented, covering the subsidiary transfers, the personal account, the timeline of movements relative to our marriage, and a formal assessment of the prenup disclosure violation. Helen had also retained a copy of the original prenup with her own annotations on the disclosure clause. She had prepared a 1-page summary document that extracted the key clause and the key finding in language a non-attorney could read in under 2 minutes. She slid that summary across the desk. I read it once, then again. The language was clean and direct. It stated that the prenuptial agreement signed between Marcus and me contained a mutual financial disclosure requirement. It stated that Marcus had demonstrably failed to disclose the transfer of personal savings to a family-controlled account prior to signing. It stated that under the agreement's own terms, this breach voided the asset protection clauses applicable to the breaching party. It cited the clause by page and paragraph number. At the bottom, Douglas's name and credentials were listed as the source of the financial findings. Helen said, "This is what you bring to dinner." I looked at her. She said, "Not the 47-page report. That stays with me and gets filed. What you bring is this page. And the prenup itself with the clause bookmarked. That's all you need in the room. Everything else is already in motion." I asked what in motion meant. She said that once the dinner happened, however it happened, she was prepared to file within 24 hours. She had already drafted the initial filing. She had already communicated with Douglas about being available for a formal proceeding. She said the filing would include the forensic report, the prenup analysis, and a formal claim that the asset protection structure Marcus had been counting on was void. She also said one more thing. She said, "He's going to come to that dinner believing he has already won. The prenup protects him. The house is out of reach, the savings are gone, and you don't know any of it. That's the version of reality he's been building for 2 years. Let him sit in it for as long as he needs to." I asked what I should do when he made his move. She said, "Put the prenup on the table, open to page 3. I practiced that at home twice. Alone in the kitchen, the document in my bag, just running the motion. Take out the document, set it down. Open to page 3. The highlighted clause was already marked with a yellow tab so thin it was invisible unless you were looking for it. The second time I practiced it, I was calm enough that I almost scared myself. In the 2 weeks before the dinner, I continued the same parallel existence. Work, home, dinner, television, Marcus's arm around me on the couch. He was in good spirits. He was buying new clothes. He had a haircut that was slightly sharper than his usual. Once I came home and smelled something on his jacket that was not his cologne and not mine, something with a floral base I didn't recognize. I hung the jacket back on the hook and said nothing. I backed up every document to a cloud account Marcus did not know existed. I backed it up again to a drive I kept in my desk at work. Helen had copies of everything. Douglas had copies of everything. The original prenup lived in Helen's office safe. I had a single printed copy of the summary document and the prenup in a slim folder inside my bag. Gerald called Marcus the night before the dinner. I heard Marcus's end of the conversation from the hallway. Short, clipped answers. Yes. Fine, tomorrow. It's handled. Then quieter, something I couldn't make out. He came back to the living room and sat down and picked up the remote like he had stepped out to check the weather. I looked at him. I thought, you have no idea. I went to bed early that night. I slept better than I had in months. The day of the dinner, I went to work, not because I had to. I had enough leave saved that I could have taken the day and no one would have questioned it. But sitting at home with nothing between me and the evening felt like the wrong kind of preparation. Work kept my hands and my mind on something concrete, and concrete was what I needed. I had a morning call with 2 of my regional managers about a distribution delay out of the Newark hub. I worked through it methodically, identified the bottleneck, reassigned 2 routes, sent a follow-up summary to the team. Patris passed my office around 10 and looked through the glass and gave me a small nod. She knew it was today. I had told her the night before briefly without details. She had said simply, "You're ready." I had believed her. I ate lunch at my desk, something small. My stomach was not interested in food. Around 2 in the afternoon, I closed my office door and called Helen. She answered on the second ring. I asked if everything was still in place. She said yes. The filing was drafted, Douglas was on standby, and she had an associate at the office through the evening in case anything needed to be handled quickly after the dinner. She said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Steady." She said that was exactly right. She said, "Remember, you don't need to say much. The document says it for you. Your only job tonight is to let him finish." I said I understood. She said one more thing before she hung up. She said, "Whatever happens in that room, you have already won the part that matters. Tonight is just the part where he finds out." I held onto that sentence for the rest of the afternoon. I left the office at 4, went home, showered, got dressed carefully. Not dramatically, I wasn't trying to perform anything. But I wore a dress I felt strong in, deep green, one Marcus had never particularly noticed, and his mother had once called a little much for my coloring. I did my makeup slowly, like I had all the time in the world because I did. I checked my bag twice. The folder was there. Prenup on top, summary sheet beneath it, page 3 tabbed in yellow. I zipped the bag and set it by the door. Marcus came home at 5:30 to change. He was in good spirits in the particular way he had been for weeks, slightly elevated, slightly performing. He complimented my dress, which was notable enough that I registered it. He straightened his tie in the hallway mirror and caught my eye in the reflection and smiled. I smiled back. We drove to the restaurant separately. He said he had a call to make on the way and would meet me there. I said that was fine. I needed the 20 minutes alone anyway. I parked a block from the restaurant and sat in the car for a moment. I thought about the woman who had signed a 4-page document at 23 without reading it properly because a man with wine already poured had called it a formality. I thought about the kitchen in Westchester and the sweet potato gratin sitting untouched on the far counter. I thought about the filing cabinet and the lease and the hallway and my husband's voice saying she signed the prenup without reading it properly. That was the ball game. I thought about $62,000. Then I picked up my bag and got out of the car. Gerald and Renata were already at the table when I arrived. Gerald stood when he saw me, which he always did, a performance of manners he had maintained for 6 years regardless of everything underneath it. Renata air-kissed my cheek and said I looked lovely. Her eyes did a quick inventory of the dress and found no visible fault, which seemed to cost her something. Marcus arrived 4 minutes later. He came in looking slightly flushed, slightly too bright, the way someone looks when they have just finished a conversation that pleased them. He kissed me on the cheek and sat down and picked up the menu, and the table settled into its familiar geometry. Gerald at the head, Renata to his left, Marcus across from me at the far end where I had always been. The first 20 minutes were ordinary. Gerald ordered wine and consulted no one about the choice. Renata asked about the menu with the focused attention she gave to any situation she wanted to control. Marcus talked about a property deal that was moving well, and Gerald asked follow-up questions, and they talked across the table to each other in the easy shorthand of people whose relationship predated me and would outlast me in their minds. I ate bread. I drank water. I watched. The waiter came and took our orders. Gerald ordered for Renata without asking her, which he always did, and she did not correct him, which she never did. Marcus ordered the most expensive thing on the menu with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the evening was already decided. The appetizers arrived. Small talk. A story from Gerald about a golf game. Renata asking about a mutual acquaintance of theirs I had met twice. Marcus refilling his wine glass. I waited. It came between the appetizers and the main course. Marcus set down his glass. He straightened slightly in his chair. Gerald became very still in the particular way of someone who knows a cue when they hear it. Renata picked up her wine but didn't drink. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded envelope. He set it on the table. Then he slid it across the white tablecloth toward me, slowly, deliberately, like a check. He leaned forward and said it quietly enough that only the table could hear. I took everything. Enjoy the streets. He was smiling when he said it. I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. I looked at Gerald, who was watching me with the careful neutrality of a man waiting to see if the plan holds. I looked at Renata, who had set her wine down now and whose mouth was arranged in something that was almost sympathy but not quite. They had all known. The whole table had known. I picked up the envelope. I opened it. I read the first page of the divorce filing well enough to confirm what it was. Then I set it down beside my bread plate. I reached into my bag. I took my time. That was the part Marcus had not planned for. He had planned for tears or for frozen silence or for me to pick up my bag and leave. He had probably planned for all three and decided any of them would do. What he had not planned for was me reaching calmly into my bag and setting a slim folder on the white tablecloth like I had been waiting to do exactly this, which I had. I placed the prenup on top. Opened it to page 3. The yellow tab caught the candlelight for just a moment. Then I placed the one-page summary directly on top of the divorce filing, over the envelope, so it was the first thing the table could see. Marcus looked at the folder. His smile held for another 2 seconds on momentum alone. Then it changed. Not dramatically. Just a small recalibration around the eyes, the look of a man who has stepped onto a floor he expected to be solid and felt it give slightly underfoot. He said, "What is this?" Not a question, a statement with a question's shape. I said, "It's the prenuptial agreement, page 3, the highlighted section." He picked up the summary sheet first. I watched his eyes move across the first 2 lines. He put it down and picked up the prenup itself, turned to page 3, found the clause. His jaw tightened. Gerald leaned forward, said, "Marcus." Marcus held up one finger without looking at his father. Still reading. Renata looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the table. That was the first shift. Gerald, who had been the still center of every family dynamic for 6 years, looking at the tablecloth instead of at me. His fork was resting at the edge of his plate where he had set it down mid-bite. He did not pick it up again. Marcus set the prenup down. He looked at me and said, "This doesn't mean what you think it means." I said, "A forensic accountant spent 8 weeks documenting what it means. His report is 47 pages. My attorney has it. It gets filed tomorrow morning." The word attorney landed on the table like something dropped from a height. Renata's hand moved toward her wine glass and stopped halfway. She left her hand flat on the tablecloth, fingers slightly spread, and did not pick up the glass. She was looking at Marcus now, not at me. That was new. For 6 years, Renata had watched me across tables like I was a variable that needed monitoring. Now she was watching her son like he was the variable. Gerald said, "Now let's just slow down." I looked at him. I said, "The subsidiary account has been traced, Gerald. All 11 transfers. Douglas was very thorough." Gerald's mouth opened and closed. He picked up his water glass and set it down without drinking. A small motion, almost nothing, but his hand was not entirely steady, and the glass landed slightly harder than he intended. A small, flat sound against the tablecloth that made Renata glance at him. The waiter appeared at the edge of the table with our main courses balanced on a tray. He read the silence with the practiced instinct of someone who had walked into the wrong moment before and stopped 2 feet from the table. Nobody looked at him. He set the plates down one by one, each landing in the specific quiet of a table that had stopped being a dinner and left faster than he had arrived. Nobody touched the food. Marcus said, "We can talk about this privately. This is not the place." I said, "You chose the place." He looked at me for a moment with something new in his expression. Not the smile, not the easy confidence, something tighter. He said, "You've been planning this." I said, "You've been planning this for 2 years. I've been planning this for 6 months. The difference is that mine is documented." Gerald leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms and looked at the middle distance the way people do when they are trying to look unbothered and cannot quite get there. The man who had spent years managing this family's financial architecture from the head of every table he sat at was now sitting very still with his arms folded, and his dinner going cold, and nothing to say that would help. A woman at the table immediately to our left had stopped her own conversation. I was aware of her in my peripheral vision, very still, facing forward with the practiced discretion of someone pretending not to hear while hearing everything. Her companion had stopped talking too. The table beyond them had gone slightly quieter. The room was listening. Marcus lowered his voice, said, "The disclosure clause is not going to hold up the way you think." I said, "Your attorney can make that argument. Mine disagrees. And the forensic report makes it very difficult to argue that the asset movements before our engagement were anything other than intentional concealment." Gerald said, "Marcus, we need to call Richard." Marcus pulled out his phone. That was when the door to the restaurant opened. I had not planned this part. This part was its own arrival. Her name was apparently Simone. I knew that from the lease agreement, which had a secondary contact listed that I had cross-referenced over several weeks until I had a full name, a profile, a photograph. I had not told Helen about her. Helen did not need her. Simone was not part of the legal strategy, but Marcus had apparently invited her. I understood that now. Watching her come through the door in a coat, I recognized the cost of scanning the room with the particular look of someone who expects to be a surprise and has been looking forward to it. She spotted Marcus. She started toward the table. She was halfway across the restaurant before she registered that something about the tableau was wrong. She slowed. The papers on the table. Marcus with his phone out and his jaw tight. Gerald with his arms crossed and his water glass sitting crooked. Renata with her hand still flat on the tablecloth and her wine untouched. And me sitting across from Marcus entirely still. Simone reached the table. She looked at the papers spread across the white cloth. She looked at me. She looked at Marcus. Marcus said her name very quietly. She picked up the summary sheet. She was quick, I gave her that. Her eyes moved fast and she understood fast, and when she looked up at Marcus, her expression had shed entirely the one she had walked in with. She said, "You told me the prenup protected everything." Marcus said, "It does, this is just," she said. "It says here it doesn't." She set the sheet down and looked at him with a long, assessing look, the kind that takes stock and comes up short. Then she looked at Gerald. Gerald did not look back at her. He looked at the table. That was when I understood how much Gerald had known about Simone specifically. He couldn't meet her eyes because meeting her eyes would have required acknowledging the full shape of what he had helped build. The plan, the girlfriend, the exit strategy, the dinner staged for maximum humiliation. Gerald had known all of it and had sat across from me at holiday tables for years and passed the bread and called me family. Renata picked up her wine glass. Finally, she drank from it in one long, slow motion and set it down and looked at the far wall and said nothing. The nothing was its own full sentence. The woman at the next table was no longer pretending. She had turned slightly in her chair, not fully, just enough, the way people do in restaurants when something has gone past the point where politeness requires they ignore it. Her companion was looking at Marcus with the open expression of a stranger who has just learned something about a person they will never meet again. Marcus tried once more. He looked at me and lowered his voice further below conversational and said, "Dana, we can work something out, you don't need to file. We can sit down with both attorneys and handle this quietly." I said, "It's already handled." He said, "The house," I said, "is in the filing." Along with the subsidiary account, the personal account he opened 4 years in, and the $62,000. Gerald's name is on the subsidiary documentation. Whether that stays inside the divorce filing or becomes part of something broader depends on how the next conversation goes. Gerald unfolded his arms. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at Marcus and said nothing, but the look said something. It said, "You told me she wouldn't push back." Marcus looked at his father. Something passed between them that I had no name for. 6 years of watching those two operate in tandem, and this was the first time I had ever seen the current between them run cold. Simone stepped back from the table. One step, then another, subtle but visible, the physical grammar of someone detaching from a situation they have decided is not theirs to inherit. She said, "Call me when this is resolved." Then she walked back across the restaurant the way she had come. The door opened. The door closed. The table was very quiet. Gerald pushed his chair back. All the way this time, not the earlier partial withdrawal but a full push, the chair legs dragging slightly on the floor. He stood up. He took his jacket from the back of the chair and he looked at Marcus and said, "I'm going to call Richard from outside." His voice was controlled and quiet, and it contained no apology and no acknowledgement of what he had just watched unfold. He was already moving back to management mode. But he was standing up. He was leaving the table. Renata watched him go. Then she looked at me for a long moment, the first time she had looked directly at me since I had placed the folder on the table. Her expression was complicated in a way I had rarely seen from her. She was not apologetic. Renata was not built for apology. But there was something in the way she was looking at me that was different from anything I had seen in 6 years. Like she was seeing something she had decided a long time ago not to look at. She said, "Dana." I waited. She did not say anything else, just my name sitting there. Maybe she had intended more. Maybe that was all she had. She picked up her bag from the floor beside her chair, folded her napkin on the table with the neat precision of someone who maintains form when everything else has gone formless, and stood up. She followed Gerald toward the door without another word. Marcus and I were alone at the table. The restaurant had mostly returned to its own business, or was performing the return. The woman at the next table had gone back to her companion. The ambient noise had reconstituted itself around us, but the table itself was an island. 4 place settings, 4 untouched main courses, 1 envelope of divorce papers, and the prenup open to page 3. Marcus looked at the papers. He looked at me. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "My attorney will be in contact tomorrow. The filing will reflect the full forensic findings. The house, the savings, the subsidiary account, the personal account, all of it." He said, "You're going to take everything." I looked at him. I said, "I'm going to take what's mine. You should have considered the difference." He looked down at the table. For a moment, he looked less like the man who had slid an envelope across a white cloth an hour ago and more like someone who had just understood the full cost of a decision he had made years earlier and spent years being certain was foolproof. I picked up the prenup and the summary sheet and put them back in my folder. I zipped my bag. I stood up. I looked at the table one last time. The untouched food, the crooked water glass, the divorce papers sitting where Marcus had placed them with such deliberate satisfaction. I said, "Happy anniversary." Then I walked out of the restaurant. The night air outside was cold and clean, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it. My phone rang 11 minutes later. Helen. I said, "It went exactly the way you said it would." She said, "Good, I'll see you in the morning." Helen filed at 9:15 the following morning. I was sitting in her office when it happened, coffee going cold in my hand, watching her assistant walk the documents to the filing desk with the calm efficiency of people who do consequential things every day and do not make theater of it. Helen came back to her desk and said, "It's in." 2 words. I nodded. Outside her office window, the city was doing its ordinary Tuesday morning, and I watched it for a moment and thought, "It's in." I drove to work afterward. Patris was at her desk when I passed. She looked up and read my face and nodded once, slow and certain. I nodded back. We did not need more than that. The first call Marcus made after the dinner was apparently to Richard. The second was to Gerald. I know this because Helen told me what Richard's opening communication looked like, which was aggressive in the specific way of an attorney who has been handed a losing position and is performing confidence anyway. The prenup was solid, the clause was ambiguous, the forensic findings were challengeable. Standard. Helen sent back the 47-page report with a cover letter that was 2 paragraphs long. Richard's second communication arrived 4 days later. The tone had changed. I did not hear the details of what shifted in those 4 days, but Helen told me afterward that the subsidiary account findings were the pressure point. Gerald's name appearing formally in a forensic report was one thing. Gerald's name appearing in a civil proceeding attached to a fraud claim was a different category of problem entirely, one with consequences that extended well beyond the divorce and into the business structures he had spent decades building. Gerald was not willing to let that happen. Whatever conversation he had with Marcus in those 4 days, Marcus came to the negotiating table. The negotiation ran 11 weeks. I will not pretend it was clean or easy because it was neither. There was a week in the 3rd month where Marcus's side made a counteroffer so far below reasonable that Helen said it flatly, and I sat with the phone to my ear and felt something hot move through me that I had to breathe through carefully. There were documents I had to read and sign and reread. There were decisions requiring me to think about money and property and future stability in ways I had not had to before, at least not with this much at stake. But the clause held. The report held. Gerald's exposure held most of all. One afternoon in the 7th week, Helen called to tell me that Gerald had made a private offer to buy out my share of the house directly, circumventing the broader asset dispute. Cash, fair market assessment, clean transfer. Helen said he had apparently decided that having me as a claimant on a property bearing his name was a situation he wanted resolved finally and without further visibility. I said, "What do you recommend?" She said, "Take it. It's full value, it closes the house question cleanly, and it keeps Gerald's subsidiary exposure in the filing where it pressures the rest of the negotiation. He's paying to make one problem disappear. Let him." The check from Gerald cleared on a Thursday. I sat with the confirmation on my laptop screen for a long moment. 6 years of dinners in that house. 6 years of Renata reorganizing my cabinets and Gerald passing bread, and the whole careful performance of welcome that had covered a plan I had not been meant to survive financially. A check. Clean transfer. Problem resolved. I thought about the prenup I had signed on a couch with wine already poured and almost laughed. The final settlement gave me the $62,000 documented and returned, the full equitable calculation on the marital savings, and a clean financial separation with no claim from Marcus on my salary or my future. The prenup protected almost nothing he had designed it to protect. I found an apartment 2 weeks before the settlement finalized. 2 bedrooms, east-facing kitchen windows, a building with a doorman who learned my name in the first week. I signed the lease myself, alone, my name the only name on the page. Moving day was a Saturday in March. Patris came with her car and her characteristic absence of ceremony. We made 3 trips. She ordered pizza and we ate it on the floor of the new living room, no furniture yet, boxes stacked against the walls, and she looked around and said, "How does it feel?" I thought about it. I said it felt like being exactly the right size for the space. She said, "Good," and took another slice. The silences from Marcus's family came in different shapes. Renata never called. Not a message. Not the kind of brief, formal acknowledgement people sometimes send when a long relationship ends badly. Nothing. I had spent 6 years at that woman's table. She had reorganized my kitchen and critiqued my dress and called me family with both hands extended and had known, at some point, what was being built around me. When the structure that required my silence was no longer intact, she had nothing to say to me. Gerald's silence was a different texture. Gerald had written a significant check, been named in a forensic report, narrowly avoided a civil proceeding, and watched an evening he had helped engineer collapse in a restaurant in front of a woman he had underestimated for 6 years. His silence felt less like indifference and more like a man who understood exactly what had happened and had decided that acknowledging it would cost him more than not acknowledging it. I heard, through a mutual acquaintance with no reason to protect anyone, that the dynamic between Marcus and Gerald had become strained after the settlement. That did not surprise me. Gerald had invested significantly in a plan that had failed, and the failure had exposed him in ways that required management. I imagined the Thursday lunches had a different texture now. I heard that Simone had not called Marcus as she had said she would. I heard this the same way I heard everything else about his life after the dinner, which is to say accidentally and without seeking it. I did not follow what happened to him closely. I found I did not need to. What I needed was already present.